The top quintile, by contrast, per family, has paid about $13,000 in extra taxes. If we go further up the income range, the numbers get bigger, of course. The top 5% pays about half of all federal taxes, meaning $250 billion. So their average payment so far is $43,000. In short, high-income people are paying a very high share of the budget cost of the U.S. war in Iraq. By the way, one of my victories, I joined the Peace Coalition of Monterey County, our group Libertarians for Peace did, and we're the only non-left, non-liberal group there. And I gave a now this and managed to say that and have people get it to some extent. Now, what about this idea that corporations gain from the war? Well, it's true that some corporations gain. Obviously, defense contractors gain. Obviously, companies like Halliburton gain. But it is not true that corporations in general gain. War is incredibly destructive. And a person who responded to my anti-war column on this said, well, you know, high-income people own a large part of the corporations. Well, let's go through it, an example of that. Let's assume the government taxes $1 billion. High-income people are going to pay half of that, or $500 million. Let's say the government spends $1 billion on the war effort, on a firm that's a member of the military-industrial complex. That billion is not a net gain to the firm. If you apply the typical upper end of the profits as a percentage of income for the firm, 10%, that means the firm's gain is $100 million. So even if high-income people owned the whole firm, they would get $100 million. And what would they pay in taxes for that? $500 million. And I've stated all those numbers to give an upper estimate of their gain. Benefiting high-income people by spending on war is like trying to feed sparrows by feeding horses. In my $1 billion example, the deadweight loss is $900 million, and that's assuming the bombs do no harm. Now, it is true that the cost of oil falls disproportionately on low-income people, and because of the war, there's less oil coming out of Iraq now than there was during the sanctions. About 400,000 barrels a day less, which doesn't sound like a lot. It's 0.5% of world output. Because of the highly inelastic demand for oil, that alone accounts for a 5% increase in price. So of our roughly $130 per barrel, that's about $6.50 a barrel. And I don't want to go past Iraq and Afghanistan without talking about the enormous loss in civil liberties. And I could see it coming. I could see it coming on September 11th. I watched the news that night, and Tom Brokaw said, well, I guess we're going to have to start looking at losing some of our liberties. And so what he had in mind, I think, is, well, you know, you might need to sacrifice certain liberties to get a certain amount of security. Of course, you know the famous line that you'll deserve neither, but even worse, you'll get neither. But beyond that, I gave a talk to David Thoreau's Institute on this shortly after, and I said, okay, let's talk. Tell us what civil liberties you want to abandon, and tell us how that's going to lead to this increase in security. Let's have that discussion at least. Instead, what we got was people kind of acting like the Judean Liberation Army in that great film, The Life of Brian. Do you remember when Christ is on the cross, or Brian is on the cross, and those people go to save him, and they're willing to commit suicide? So what do? They go up and they commit suicide. He's still on the cross. Thanks. Well, it's like, oh, we got the first part right. Let's drop the civil liberties. Ooh, forgot to think about why we were doing it. It's kind of like Eric Garris, the managing editor of antiwar.com, says it as follows. It's a great British series, Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. There are two of them. They have a crisis. Someone says, something must be done. This is something, therefore it must be done. Now, I want to just talk about kind of using economics to look at other aspects of foreign policy. One of the most valuable things economists do is reveal the unintended consequences of government policies. Ludwig von Mises made a career out of this, or the last 20 years of his career. Rent control, for example, which governments often choose as a way of achieving cheap housing, achieves the opposite. Reduces the housing stock, reduces the quality, reduces maintenance. So government can then go ahead and drop the rent control, or it can start subsidizing housing. Which do you think it typically does? And we had this in the 1970s. The price controls on gasoline kept the price artificially low. We started buying we kept buying gas guzzlers. Jimmy Carter and his bureaucrats called us energy pigs. But Ford and his bureaucrats actually did the damage with the corporate average fuel economy laws on cars. And auto producers responded by producing lighter cars that killed more people. Similar kinds of unintended consequences, it turns out, have led to further interventions in foreign policy. These have been pointed out by, unfortunately, rarely by economists. Economists haven't studied this much. And it's not as if there's a lot of data out there. And two of the best sources are the late Jonathan Whitney and Chalmers Johnson. Whitney, for example, details a number of instances of negative consequences, even from a narrow U.S. government point of view, of interventions in other countries' affairs. Summarizing some of these during the Cold War, he writes, quote, "The excuse for intervention, of course, is the notion that if we don't fight, Moscow will win by default. Yet as one travels the globe, from Indochina to Cuba to Angola, one finds that the third world countries where the Soviets are alleged to have the strongest influence are precisely those countries where we fought. Meanwhile, in countries that weren't militarily threatened by the United States, where Soviet influence has had a chance to flunk on its own merits, it has. In Egypt, Ghana, Algeria, Somalia, Nigeria, Indochina, except in occupied countries along the Soviets' own borders, the Russians have been kicked out." And Whitney draws 15 lessons for that, and I want to highlight 3. 1, forceful intervention by a big power in a third world country, no matter how well-intentioned, is almost always dramatically harmful to the people who live in the country being intervened in. 2, intervention by either major power, regardless of what the other is doing, usually tends to be counterproductive for the intervener. And 3, force creates enmity. If it creates respect as well, that is less enduring. Chalmers Johnson even gives a name to this. He called that the CIA coined. He calls it blowback. Now, the term blowback is narrower than Johnson uses it. The CIA used it to refer to the unintended consequences of policies that were kept secret from the American people. But we have unintended consequences from things that aren't kept secret also. The World War I was not exactly a secret, but it helped lead to Hitler. Indeed, and one of, by the way, Johnson's examples he gives of blowback is, again, not a secret policy, but instead a reaction to a widely known government policy. The 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, is now widely recognized as a retaliation for a 1986 Reagan administration aerial raid in Libya that killed Muammar Gaddafi's daughter. By the way, that day I became an American citizen. I started to wonder. And of course, there are the unintended consequences with the CIA as early as 1963 helping the Ba'ath Party take over in Iraq. And you know who came out of that. And of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And I would tell that whole story, but it's been told a couple of times now, and very well, especially by Stephen Kinzer. But I just want to highlight one thing he didn't mention. He mentioned Kermit Roosevelt being involved in that. He didn't mention another name you might have heard of, Norman Schwarzkopf. Not Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the daddy. He helped overthrow the Iranian government. And of course, when President Carter was asked about this after the '53 event, because of course the hostages were taken in 1979, he said it was ancient history. Has anyone ever in this room ever taken a course in ancient history? Raise your hand. Do you remember something being talked about from 26 years ago? Another use of economics in foreign policy, and I wrote an article on this in an academic journal laying some of this stuff out. I've started this process.